The history of indigenous peoples, IPs, in the Philippines is deeply intertwined with the broader history of colonization, cultural survival, and the fight for land and rights. Long before the arrival of colonial powers, indigenous communities lived harmoniously in their ancestral lands, guided by their own governance systems and cultural practices. These communities, known as Indigenous Cultural Communities, ICCs, were self-sufficient, governed by customary laws passed down through generations, and deeply connected to the natural environment. Their knowledge systems, rooted in agriculture, medicine, and natural resource management, were crucial to the sustainability of their cultures and territories. However, the advent of foreign colonization in the Philippines disrupted the delicate balance that indigenous communities had maintained for centuries. Spanish colonization, which began in the 16th century, introduced new systems of land ownership, governance, and religion, which undermined indigenous ways of life. The Spanish forced indigenous peoples into labor and conversion to Christianity, often disregarding their traditions and practices. These early encounters were the beginning of a long history of marginalization, as indigenous peoples found themselves on the losing end of land seizures, forced assimilation, and violence. Following the end of Spanish rule, the American occupation in the late 19th and early 20th centuries continued the process of dispossession. The United States, under its colonial regime, introduced policies that further alienated indigenous communities from their ancestral lands. The establishment of large plantations and the expansion of mining and logging industries during this period contributed significantly to the degradation of indigenous territories, further compounding the struggles faced by these communities. Despite these challenges, many indigenous groups remained resilient, clinging to their cultures and traditions. During the American colonial period, indigenous groups like the Igorot, Lumad, and Ida, among others, maintained their resistance against the encroachment of their lands. In the face of state-sponsored violence and exploitation, they managed to retain parts of their culture, language, and land. However, the central government continued to disregard their rights, often pushing them to the margins of society and leaving them vulnerable to further exploitation. It was not until the late 20th century that the Philippine government began to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples, largely due to the tireless advocacy of IP organizations and activists. One of the key milestones in this journey was the passage of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, in 1997, Republic Act 8371, which became a turning point in the struggle for the recognition and protection of indigenous rights in the Philippines. This law was the culmination of years of organizing, lobbying, and legal battles fought by indigenous communities, their allies, and advocates. It marked the first time that the government formally acknowledged the existence of indigenous communities and their unique cultural, social, and economic rights. The IPRA sought to address the historical injustices suffered by indigenous peoples and ensure the protection of their ancestral domains, which had been systematically encroached upon by state policies and private corporations. The law also recognized the right of indigenous peoples to self-governance, the preservation of their culture, and the right to free, prior, and informed consent, FPAC, in matters that directly affect their lands and way of life. This legal framework provided indigenous peoples with the tools and support needed to challenge land grabs, human rights abuses, and the marginalization they had endured for centuries. A crucial element of the IPRA was the provision for the creation of the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR. The IPMR is a position within the local government system that ensures indigenous peoples have a direct voice in governance. As an ex officio member of the local legislative councils, Sangguniang Barangay, Bayan, Panlungsod, or Panlalawigan, the IPMR advocates for policies that protect the rights and welfare of indigenous communities. The creation of this position was a significant victory for indigenous communities. as it formally integrated their representation into the political system, giving them a mechanism to influence local governance. The establishment of the IPMR was a groundbreaking move that allowed indigenous communities to participate in the formal political process. The IPMR is not just a figurehead. They are mandated by law to represent the interests of the indigenous peoples within their jurisdiction. Their primary responsibility is to ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples are upheld in the local government's legislative processes. By attending sessions of the Sangguniang and participating in deliberations, the IPMR plays a crucial role in ensuring that indigenous issues are considered when laws, policies, and ordinances are being crafted. One of the most important aspects of the IPMR's role is advocating for the protection of ancestral domains and natural resources. Ancestral domains refer to the land, water, and natural resources that indigenous peoples have traditionally occupied and used. The IPMR ensures that these territories are protected from encroachment by outside interests, such as mining companies, logging operations, and urban development. Through their advocacy, the IPMR pushes for the recognition of indigenous peoples' rights to their land, ensuring that these communities have the right to control and manage their natural resources. In addition to land rights, the IPMR also focuses on promoting social justice for indigenous peoples. This includes advocating for access to education, healthcare, and livelihood opportunities that are culturally appropriate and accessible to indigenous communities. By ensuring that these services are aligned with the needs and values of indigenous peoples, the IPMR helps to address the historical disparities that have long existed between indigenous and non-indigenous populations. Moreover, the IPMR is responsible for promoting cultural preservation and the recognition of indigenous traditions, languages, and governance systems. This includes advocating for the inclusion of indigenous culture in educational curricula, ensuring the protection of sacred sites and cultural landmarks, and supporting the transmission of traditional knowledge and practices to future generations. The IPMR is also instrumental in protecting indigenous governance systems, which often operate alongside or independently from the formal state system. This dual structure allows indigenous communities to maintain their sovereignty and cultural identity while participating in the broader political system. The IPMR's role is not only about protection, but also about empowerment. Through their advocacy, the IPMR works to strengthen the political and social position of indigenous peoples, ensuring they have a seat at the table where decisions that affect their lives are being made. This is a critical step toward achieving true self-determination for indigenous communities, as it allows them to participate fully in the democratic process while preserving their cultural integrity and governance systems. The passage of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, in 1997 was a monumental achievement for indigenous peoples in the Philippines. It provided the legal framework that recognized their ancestral domains, cultural rights, and self-governance. However, while the law acknowledged these rights, its practical implementation required a more structured approach to ensure that indigenous peoples had a direct voice in the legislative processes that affected their lives. This led to the establishment of the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, a position that was specifically created to serve as the link between indigenous communities and local government units, LGUs. Initially, the role of the IPMR was met with some resistance, both within the indigenous communities and among local government officials. For many, the concept of an ex officio representative, someone who was not directly elected but still had the authority to participate in the decision-making process, was a new and unfamiliar idea. In traditional indigenous governance, leaders were often chosen through customary laws and practices, which did not necessarily align with the Western-style political systems of the local government. However, the IPMR position quickly proved to be a vital mechanism for ensuring that indigenous peoples were not excluded from the political and legislative processes. The role of the IPMR evolved from being simply a ceremonial position into a powerful advocacy tool that allowed Indigenous peoples to actively participate in shaping policies that directly impacted their communities. As the IPMR gained influence, it became evident that their role was not just about protecting land rights or advocating for cultural preservation. It was about ensuring that Indigenous peoples had an active role in governance and development. The IPMR's involvement in local legislative councils has allowed for the integration of Indigenous perspectives into policies and ordinances. For instance, in matters related to land use, mining, and environmental protection, the IPMR has played a critical role in ensuring that these issues are addressed in ways that respect the rights and traditions of Indigenous communities. This has been especially important in rural areas, where Indigenous communities are often at the mercy of powerful corporate interests seeking to exploit natural resources in ancestral domains. While the establishment of the IPMR has been a significant step toward recognizing Indigenous rights, the position has not been without its challenges. One of the key difficulties faced by the IPMR is the tension between traditional Indigenous governance systems and the formal political structures of the local government. In many cases, Indigenous leaders are elected or chosen based on customary laws and practices that are not always aligned with the formal processes of political appointment or election in local government units. This has created situations where the IPMR may face challenges in gaining the trust and legitimacy of both the local government and the Indigenous communities they represent. Some local government officials may view the IPMR position as redundant or unnecessary, especially in areas where Indigenous peoples are already underrepresented in government. On the other hand, Indigenous communities may view the IPMR as a product of a system that does not fully respect their sovereignty or cultural integrity. Despite these challenges, the IPMR role has presented significant opportunities for advocacy and empowerment. The position provides a platform for Indigenous peoples to assert their rights and raise awareness about the challenges they face. IPMRs have become important advocates for issues such as land rights, environmental justice, and the preservation of Indigenous cultures. In some cases, the IPMR has been instrumental in negotiating agreements with government agencies and private sector actors to ensure that Indigenous peoples benefit from development projects without sacrificing their cultural values or ancestral domains. Moreover, the IPMR has become a symbol of empowerment for Indigenous youth, women, and elders. By actively participating in governance, the IPMR has helped to inspire a new generation of Indigenous leaders who are committed to preserving their community's heritage and advancing their rights. This has been especially important in areas where traditional governance structures are at risk of being eroded by external pressures such as globalization, urbanization, and the encroachment of corporate interests. The role of the IPMR has also opened doors for greater collaboration between Indigenous communities and other sectors of society. By working with government agencies, non-governmental organizations, and international bodies, the IPMR has helped to secure resources and support for Indigenous development programs. These programs often focus on improving access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities for Indigenous peoples, all while respecting their cultural practices and traditions. One of the most profound impacts of the IPMR has been its role in fostering more inclusive governance at the local level. Traditionally, Indigenous peoples in the Philippines have been marginalized in the political process, often excluded from decisions that affect their lands, resources, and communities. The IPMR has helped to change this by ensuring that Indigenous voices are heard and considered in local legislative and policy-making processes. The IPMR's role as an ex officio member of the local legislative council means that they have a direct influence on the crafting of policies that affect Indigenous communities. This has been particularly important in areas such as land rights, environmental protection, and social justice. For example, The IPMR has played a pivotal role in advocating for the passage of ordinances that protect indigenous ancestral domains from encroachment by mining, logging, and agricultural industries. Through their advocacy, the IPMR has helped to secure the recognition of indigenous peoples' right to free, prior, and informed consent (FPIC) in all matters related to their land and resources. The IPMR also serves as a bridge between the government and indigenous communities, ensuring that policies are not only informed by traditional knowledge, but are also culturally appropriate. This bridging role has allowed indigenous peoples to maintain their autonomy while still participating in the formal political system. It is through the IPMR that indigenous communities have been able to engage in dialogue with government officials and other stakeholders, advocating for policies that align with their values and needs. Moreover, the IPMR has played a key role in advancing the inclusion of indigenous culture and traditions in the broader societal framework. This includes pushing for the inclusion of indigenous history, languages, and practices in school curricula, as well as supporting cultural events and festivals that highlight the richness of indigenous heritage. By advocating for these initiatives, the IPMR has helped to promote a more inclusive and diverse society, where indigenous cultures are recognized and celebrated. Ultimately, the IPMR has proven to be a catalyst for change, helping to create a more inclusive and equitable political system. The position has empowered indigenous communities to take an active role in shaping their future, ensuring that their voices are heard and that their rights are protected. Through their work, the IPMR has contributed to the ongoing struggle for indigenous rights, making it clear that governance must be inclusive of all peoples, regardless of their cultural background or history. The role of the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, has evolved significantly since its inception. While initially seen as a means to ensure that indigenous communities had representation in local governance, over time, the position has become a crucial vehicle for empowering indigenous peoples and advocating for their rights. As IPMRs have grown more experienced and knowledgeable about the legislative process, they have become powerful advocates for their communities, ensuring that policies affecting indigenous peoples are more reflective of their needs and aspirations. The primary function of the IPMR within the local legislative council is to act as a voice for indigenous communities. This is especially important given the historical exclusion of indigenous peoples from the political process. In many cases, indigenous communities have been marginalized by policies that fail to recognize their unique cultural and legal status. The IPMR serves as a conduit through which these communities can participate directly in the policymaking process, ensuring that their concerns are heard and that their rights are respected. One of the key responsibilities of the IPMR is to sponsor or co-sponsor ordinances, resolutions, and legislative measures that promote the welfare of indigenous peoples. These measures often address critical issues such as land rights, access to education, healthcare, and economic development, all of which are essential for the advancement of indigenous communities. The IPMR also plays a vital role in advocating for policies that protect the environment, particularly in relation to ancestral domains and natural resources. The IPMR's influence extends beyond the local legislative council. By working with government agencies, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and international bodies, the IPMR can help to secure funding and resources for development programs that benefit indigenous communities. These programs often focus on addressing the systemic challenges that indigenous peoples face, including poverty, limited access to education, and the degradation of their ancestral lands. Moreover, the IPMR's position within the local government allows them to advocate for the inclusion of indigenous perspectives in broader national policies. As a representative of indigenous communities, the IPMR has the authority to participate in national consultations and discussions about development and human rights, thus ensuring that the needs and priorities of indigenous peoples are represented at higher levels of government. A central tenet of the IPMR's work is the preservation of indigenous culture, traditions, and environmental knowledge. Indigenous peoples have long been stewards of the land, with deep connections to the natural environment and a profound understanding of sustainable resource management. These traditional knowledge systems are invaluable in the face of modern environmental challenges such as climate change, deforestation, and the depletion of natural resources. However, indigenous cultures and practices have often been overlooked or undervalued by mainstream society and government policies. The IPMR plays a pivotal role in advocating for the protection and recognition of indigenous cultural practices. This includes promoting the inclusion of indigenous knowledge in educational curricula, ensuring the preservation of sacred sites, and supporting cultural heritage programs. By advocating for the recognition of indigenous cultures in the broader national context, the IPMR helps to ensure that these cultures are not lost in the face of modernization and globalization. One of the key areas where the IPMR's advocacy has had a significant impact is in environmental justice. Indigenous communities have historically been the custodians of some of the most biodiverse and ecologically sensitive areas in the country. These communities have long used sustainable agricultural practices, forest management techniques, and resource conservation strategies that have allowed them to live in harmony with their environment. However, these practices are under threat from industrialization, logging, mining, and other development projects that encroach upon indigenous territories. The IPMR is instrumental in ensuring that these communities have a say in development projects that affect their lands. Through their advocacy, the IPMR works to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent (FPIC) is obtained before any projects that could affect ancestral domains are undertaken. This legal requirement ensures that indigenous peoples are not only consulted, but also have the power to reject projects that they believe will harm their lands, culture, and way of life. By upholding FPIC, the IPMR helps to protect indigenous communities from exploitation and ensures that development projects are conducted in a way that respects their rights and interests. In addition to advocating for FPIC, the IPMR also works to ensure that the environmental impacts of development projects are properly assessed and mitigated. This includes monitoring the effects of mining, logging, and agricultural activities on indigenous territories, ensuring that these activities do not lead to environmental degradation or loss of biodiversity. The IPMR is also involved in lobbying for policies that promote sustainable development practices, such as community-based forest management, agroforestry, and ecotourism, all of which provide alternative sources of income for indigenous communities while also preserving their ancestral lands. Looking forward, the role of the IPMR is likely to continue evolving in response to the changing needs and aspirations of indigenous communities. As global attention increasingly turns to issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and the rights of marginalized populations, the IPMR's position may become even more critical in advocating for the recognition of indigenous peoples as key stakeholders in sustainable development. One area where the IPMR can have a significant impact is in the promotion of indigenous peoples' participation in climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. Indigenous communities are on the front lines of climate change, with their lands and resources being disproportionately affected by rising temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, and extreme weather events. Indigenous knowledge systems, however, offer valuable insights into sustainable land management and resource conservation, and the IPMR can help to ensure that these knowledge systems are recognized and integrated into national and international climate policies. Additionally, the future of the IPMR will depend on the continued strengthening of indigenous governance systems. As more and more indigenous communities assert their right to self-determination and self-governance, the IPMR's role may expand to encompass a broader range of responsibilities, including the management of ancestral domains, the implementation of community-led development projects, and the safeguarding of indigenous cultural practices. This will require ongoing support from government agencies, NGOs, and international bodies to ensure that indigenous communities have the resources and tools they need to effectively exercise their rights. Moreover, the IPMR's role will continue to be a crucial part of the broader struggle for human rights and social justice. As indigenous peoples around the world face increasing threats to their lands, cultures, and livelihoods, the IPMR will serve as a key player in advocating for their rights and ensuring that they have a seat at the table in decisions that affect their futures. By continuing to advocate for policies that protect indigenous rights, the IPMR will help to ensure that indigenous peoples are not left behind in the pursuit of social, economic, and environmental justice. Ultimately, the future of the IPMR is closely tied to the ongoing struggle for indigenous peoples' rights in the Philippines and around the world. The IPMR's role as a bridge between traditional indigenous governance and modern state systems ensures that indigenous communities have a voice in the political process and that their rights are upheld. With continued advocacy, support, and recognition, the IPMR can help to create a future where indigenous peoples are empowered, their cultures are preserved, and their rights are fully respected. As the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, continues to evolve, one of the central goals of the position is to empower indigenous leaders with the knowledge and skills necessary to effectively perform their roles in governance. Capacity-building initiatives for IPMRs are critical for ensuring that they are equipped to handle the complex responsibilities that come with representing indigenous peoples within local government structures. The IPMR is not only a political figure, but also a cultural advocate, a legal expert, and a community organizer, which requires a diverse set of skills. The IPMR is often called upon to navigate the intricacies of government bureaucracy and legal frameworks. To be effective in their role, they must be able to understand local governance structures, legislative processes, and policies that impact indigenous communities. Thus, specialized training programs focusing on law, governance, policy advocacy, and community engagement are vital for the professional development of IPMRs. Many IPMRs attend workshops, seminars, and conferences that provide them with the tools and insights needed to engage with local government officials, NGOs, and other stakeholders. Additionally, training on the legal frameworks that protect indigenous rights, such as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, and other relevant national laws, is essential for ensuring that IPMRs are well-versed in the legal protections afforded to indigenous peoples. This knowledge allows the IPMR to act as an effective advocate for their communities, ensuring that their rights are upheld in the face of threats such as land encroachment, discrimination, and exploitation. One of the most important aspects of capacity building for the IPMR is the development of communication skills. Effective communication is essential for bridging the gap between the formal governance system and indigenous communities. IPMRs must be able to communicate effectively with both the local government and their communities, ensuring that information flows smoothly between both sides. This requires fluency in local languages and dialects, as well as an understanding of cultural sensitivities. By enhancing their communication skills, IPMRs can better represent their communities and advocate for policies that align with their needs. Moreover, the capacity-building process extends beyond individual training to the strengthening of the entire indigenous political structure, IPS. The IPS is the traditional governance system of indigenous communities, which often works in parallel with the formal government system. Strengthening the IPS is crucial for ensuring that the IPMR has the full support and mandate of the community. Capacity-building initiatives for the IPS focus on enhancing leadership skills, promoting transparency, and improving decision-making processes within indigenous communities. This collaborative approach ensures that the IPMR is not working in isolation, but is instead supported by a strong, unified community. While the role of the IPMR is vital for advancing the rights of indigenous peoples, the position is not without its challenges. One of the key obstacles faced by IPMRs is the tension between traditional indigenous governance systems and the formal political system. Indigenous governance systems are often based on customary laws, community consensus, and a deep connection to the land, which can conflict with the more hierarchical and formal structures of local government. This disconnect can make it difficult for IPMRs to navigate the political landscape, as they are often caught between the traditional values of their communities and the legal requirements of the state. In some cases, the IPMR may face resistance from local government officials who do not fully understand the role or importance of the position. This lack of support can make it harder for the IPMR to carry out their duties effectively, particularly when it comes to advocating for policies that protect indigenous rights. Some local government officials may view the IPMR as a symbolic or honorary position rather than a powerful voice for the community. Overcoming this resistance requires ongoing education and advocacy to ensure that the IPMR is recognized as an essential part of the local governance structure. Another challenge faced by the IPMR is the difficulty in balancing the needs of the indigenous community with the demands of development and modernization. While indigenous peoples have the right to preserve their cultural practices and maintain control over their ancestral lands, they also face pressures from outside forces seeking to exploit these resources for economic gain. The IPMR must navigate this delicate balance, advocating for sustainable development practices that benefit indigenous communities without compromising their cultural integrity or environmental sustainability. In addition to these challenges, the IPMR must also contend with the complexities of working within a system that has historically marginalized indigenous peoples. Discrimination, both overt and subtle, remains a significant barrier to full participation in governance. Many indigenous peoples continue to face exclusion from decision-making processes, even though they are constitutionally entitled to representation. The IPMR is often tasked with challenging these systemic inequities and pushing for more inclusive policies that address the historical injustices faced by indigenous peoples. Finally, the role of the IPMR requires the ability to handle conflict and negotiation, particularly in situations where there are competing interests. For example, the IPMR may need to mediate between government authorities and indigenous communities to find common ground on issues such as land use or resource management. This requires not only diplomatic skills, but also a deep understanding of both indigenous values and the legal and political systems in which they operate. The role of the IPMR extends beyond the local level and has significant implications for national development. By ensuring that indigenous peoples are included in the political and legislative processes, the IPMR contributes to a more inclusive and equitable society. Indigenous peoples have long been excluded from the development process, with their needs often ignored or misunderstood by policymakers. The IPMR helps to address this by ensuring that the unique needs of indigenous communities are represented and that their voices are heard in the halls of power. One of the broader implications of the IPMR's role is the promotion of social justice and human rights. The IPMR is a key player in the fight against discrimination, marginalization, and exploitation. By advocating for policies that protect indigenous rights and promote social justice, the IPMR helps to ensure that indigenous peoples have the same opportunities as other citizens to thrive in the modern world. This includes advocating for better access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities, all of which are essential for the well-being of indigenous communities. Moreover, the IPMR's role has important implications for environmental sustainability. Indigenous communities have long been stewards of the land, and their traditional knowledge of resource management is invaluable in addressing global challenges such as climate change, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. By promoting the inclusion of indigenous knowledge in environmental policies, the IPMR helps to ensure that these communities continue to play a central role in the stewardship of the environment. This is particularly important as the world grapples with the urgent need to protect natural resources and mitigate the effects of climate change. Furthermore, the IPMR's advocacy for cultural preservation contributes to the broader national effort to celebrate and protect the diverse cultural heritage of the Philippines. Indigenous cultures are an integral part of the country's history and identity, and the IPMR helps to ensure that these cultures are not only preserved, but also celebrated in the broader societal context. This includes advocating for the inclusion of indigenous languages, traditions, and practices in national education curricula, as well as supporting cultural festivals and events that highlight the rich diversity of indigenous cultures. In the long term, the IPMR's work contributes to the development of a more inclusive and equitable society, where the rights and contributions of indigenous peoples are recognized and respected. By ensuring that indigenous communities have a seat at the table in the decision-making process, the IPMR plays a crucial role in building a more just and sustainable future for all Filipinos. The Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, plays an essential role in advancing sustainable development, ensuring that indigenous peoples are not left behind as the nation moves toward modernization and growth. Sustainable development, as defined by the United Nations, aims to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This includes a balance of social, economic, and environmental objectives, which often present unique challenges for indigenous communities who are deeply connected to their ancestral lands and natural resources. The IPMR's role in promoting sustainable development is multifaceted. One of the primary responsibilities of the IPMR is to advocate for the preservation of indigenous ancestral domains and the protection of natural resources. These lands have been managed for generations through traditional ecological knowledge, which includes sustainable agricultural practices, conservation methods, and resource management techniques that ensure environmental sustainability. Unfortunately, modern development often disregards these methods, leading to deforestation, resource depletion, and the loss of biodiversity. The IPMR ensures that policies affecting indigenous territories take into account the long-term environmental impact and are aligned with sustainable practices. This includes working with both local and national government agencies to develop policies that allow for responsible land use and resource extraction while preserving the rights of indigenous peoples. For example, the IPMR can advocate for community-based forest management programs, which allow indigenous communities to manage their forests sustainably while benefiting from the resources they provide. Moreover, the IPMR is instrumental in ensuring that development projects in indigenous territories respect the free, prior, and informed consent (FPAC) of the affected communities. This legal framework empowers indigenous peoples to make decisions about projects that may affect their lands and livelihoods. By advocating for FPAC, the IPMR ensures that indigenous communities have control over how their resources are used and that they can negotiate the terms of development in a way that prioritizes their well-being. As the world faces increasing environmental challenges such as climate change, the IPMR's role in promoting sustainable practices becomes even more crucial. Indigenous peoples are often the stewards of some of the most ecologically sensitive areas in the world, and their knowledge of biodiversity and ecosystem management can offer valuable insights into how to mitigate environmental damage and adapt to changing conditions. The IPMR helps to ensure that this knowledge is incorporated into national and international policies aimed at addressing environmental crises. The creation of the IPMR position has been a significant step toward achieving social justice for indigenous communities. Historically, indigenous peoples have faced marginalization, discrimination, and exclusion from mainstream society, and this has often been reflected in their lack of political representation. The IPMR serves as a critical agent for change. ensuring that Indigenous peoples are no longer sidelined in the governance process and that their concerns are addressed in the policy-making framework. Social justice for Indigenous peoples involves more than just legal recognition. It also requires tangible improvements in their quality of life. The IPMR advocates for policies that address issues such as poverty, limited access to education, and inadequate healthcare services. For example, the IPMR has been instrumental in pushing for the establishment of schools in remote Indigenous communities, where children would otherwise have to travel long distances to attend school. Access to education is a key component of social justice, as it enables Indigenous children to break the cycle of poverty and gain the skills necessary to contribute to the broader society while preserving their cultural identity. Similarly, the IPMR advocates for better healthcare services for Indigenous peoples, many of whom live in remote areas with limited access to medical facilities. The IPMR works to ensure that Indigenous communities receive health care that is culturally sensitive and appropriate to their needs. This may include the integration of traditional healing practices with modern medicine, recognizing that Indigenous knowledge of health and wellness is an important aspect of their cultural heritage. Moreover, the IPMR also works to ensure that Indigenous peoples have access to economic opportunities that allow them to thrive in the modern world without sacrificing their cultural values. This may include advocating for employment programs, skills training, and microfinancing initiatives that empower Indigenous communities to develop sustainable livelihoods. By promoting economic empowerment, the IPMR helps to ensure that Indigenous peoples can participate fully in the national economy while preserving their traditional ways of life. Ultimately, the IPMR's role in advancing social justice extends beyond advocacy for specific policies. It also involves fostering a culture of inclusivity, where Indigenous peoples are respected as equals in society. This requires challenging discriminatory attitudes, promoting awareness of Indigenous issues, and ensuring that Indigenous cultures are celebrated as integral parts of national identity. Through these efforts, the IPMR helps to create a more equitable society where all citizens, regardless of their cultural background, have the opportunity to succeed. Despite the significant progress that has been made in advancing Indigenous rights through the IPMR position, there are still numerous challenges that lie ahead. One of the most pressing challenges is the continuing threat of land grabbing and the encroachment of corporate interests on Indigenous territories. As the demand for natural resources such as minerals, timber, and agricultural land grows, Indigenous peoples are increasingly at risk of losing control over their ancestral lands. This is particularly concerning in areas where large-scale mining, logging, and agribusiness companies are seeking to exploit these resources for profit. The IPMR plays a critical role in protecting Indigenous lands from these external threats. However, the continued expansion of extractive industries and the pressures of globalization make it increasingly difficult to safeguard ancestral domains. One of the ways in which the IPMR can address this challenge is by strengthening the enforcement of the free, prior, and informed consent (FPAC) process, ensuring that Indigenous communities have a meaningful say in decisions about the use of their land and resources. Additionally, the IPMR can advocate for stronger legal protections for Indigenous lands and push for the implementation of international standards that recognize Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination and land ownership. Another challenge facing the IPMR is the need to balance development with cultural preservation. While Indigenous communities are entitled to economic development, this must not come at the expense of their cultural heritage. The IPMR must navigate the complex intersection of development, modernization, and cultural preservation, ensuring that development projects are both beneficial and respectful of Indigenous traditions. This requires a delicate balance between embracing opportunities for economic growth and preserving the cultural identity and autonomy of Indigenous peoples. Finally, The IPMR must continue to address the issue of political representation at higher levels of government. While the IPMR is an important voice within local governance structures, indigenous peoples in the Philippines still face challenges in gaining representation at the national level. The continued advocacy for broader political representation of indigenous peoples is crucial for ensuring that their rights are upheld at all levels of government. By strengthening the IPMR's role and ensuring that indigenous peoples have a seat at the table in national policymaking, the Philippines can move toward a more inclusive and equitable future for all its citizens. In conclusion, while the road ahead is filled with challenges, the role of the IPMR is vital in ensuring that indigenous peoples are not only heard but also respected as equal partners in the national governance process. Through their advocacy, capacity building, and commitment to social justice, the IPMR plays an essential role in shaping a more inclusive, sustainable, and culturally rich society. As the role of the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, continues to evolve, it is clear that the position is instrumental in strengthening the political and governance systems within indigenous communities. While the IPMR is primarily a representative in the local government units, LGUs, their influence extends beyond the confines of government offices and legislative halls. The position helps bridge the gap between indigenous governance systems, rooted in traditions and customary laws, and the formal political structures of the state. One of the key responsibilities of the IPMR is to ensure that indigenous peoples' traditional systems of governance are not only preserved, but also integrated into the broader political system. Indigenous communities have long maintained their own political structures, guided by customs, elders, and community consensus. However, these governance systems have often been overlooked or undermined by state policies that prioritize centralized power and formal political systems. The IPMR's role is vital in ensuring that these traditional structures are respected and that indigenous peoples have the right to continue governing themselves according to their customs and beliefs. The IPMR helps to integrate customary laws with modern state governance by advocating for the inclusion of traditional knowledge and practices in local decision-making. For example, in land management, indigenous peoples have long adhered to systems of stewardship and conservation that are different from Western models of resource extraction. The IPMR can advocate for the inclusion of these practices in national environmental policies, ensuring that both traditional and modern approaches to land management are respected. Moreover, the IPMR plays a crucial role in building the capacity of indigenous political structures, ensuring that leaders within these communities are well equipped to engage with government officials and stakeholders. This capacity building involves providing training in political advocacy, governance, and legal frameworks, helping indigenous leaders navigate the complexities of modern governance while maintaining their cultural integrity. The strengthening of these political systems allows indigenous communities to have greater control over their affairs, contributing to the overall empowerment of indigenous peoples. Through the IPMR, indigenous communities are also gaining a stronger voice in regional and national governance. By participating in local legislative councils, the IPMR ensures that indigenous peoples have a direct influence on policies that affect them. As a result, the role of the IPMR is not just about preserving indigenous cultures, but also about ensuring that indigenous communities are active participants in shaping their political and social futures. Another key aspect of the IPMR's role is the facilitation of dialogue between indigenous and non-indigenous communities. In a country like the Philippines, where indigenous peoples often live in rural, remote areas, there can be significant misunderstandings between indigenous communities and the broader population. These misunderstandings can lead to discrimination, exploitation, and the marginalization of indigenous peoples. The IPMR serves as a vital bridge, promoting mutual respect and understanding between these two groups. One of the main challenges facing indigenous communities is their marginalization within the larger social and political framework. Despite legal protections such as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, indigenous peoples often face prejudice, stereotyping, and exclusion from the benefits of modern society. The IPMR works to address these issues by fostering understanding and promoting inclusivity at the local level. Through the IPMR, indigenous peoples have the opportunity to engage with non-indigenous communities, fostering dialogue on critical issues such as cultural preservation, land rights, and social justice. The IPMR plays an essential role in educating non-indigenous populations about the history, culture, and rights of indigenous peoples. This education helps to counteract harmful stereotypes and build solidarity between indigenous and non-indigenous groups. It also creates a platform for discussing the shared challenges that both groups face, such as environmental degradation, poverty, and the effects of climate change. The IPMR is also involved in promoting the inclusion of indigenous perspectives in broader societal debates, such as environmental protection, education, and healthcare. By participating in local governance and advocating for policies that address the needs of both indigenous and non-indigenous populations, the IPMR helps to create a more inclusive society that values diversity and cultural heritage. This role is especially important in ensuring that indigenous peoples are not left behind in national development agendas. Additionally, the IPMR works to promote social cohesion and peace building in areas where tensions exist between indigenous and non-indigenous communities. In some regions, competition for resources such as land, water, and forests has led to conflicts between different groups. The IPMR, through their position, helps to mediate these conflicts and find solutions that respect the rights and interests of all parties involved. In doing so, the IPMR contributes to fostering a more peaceful and cooperative society. Looking toward the future, the sustainability of the IPMR position will depend on continued advocacy, policy development, and community engagement. One of the long-term goals for the IPMR is to ensure that indigenous peoples' rights are fully integrated into the fabric of Philippine governance, so that future generations will inherit a society that respects and celebrates their cultural diversity. This includes securing stronger legal protections for indigenous lands, cultures, and governance systems, ensuring that these rights are not subject to the changing whims of political leadership. The continued success of the IPMR position will also rely on the broader recognition of indigenous peoples' contributions to national development. As indigenous communities are increasingly seen as key players in areas such as environmental conservation and cultural preservation, the role of the IPMR will gain even more significance. By advocating for the inclusion of indigenous knowledge in national policies on climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable development, the IPMR will help to ensure that indigenous communities are not just passive recipients of development aid, but active participants in shaping the future of the country. Furthermore, the IPMR will need to continue to work closely with indigenous communities to ensure that their needs and aspirations are reflected in local and national policies. This includes promoting grassroots participation, ensuring that decisions are made with the full involvement of indigenous peoples, and advocating for more inclusive development models that prioritize cultural preservation and environmental sustainability. The legacy of the IPMR will ultimately be measured by the degree to which indigenous peoples can exercise their right to self-determination and self-governance. This will require a continued commitment to strengthening indigenous political structures, fostering intercultural dialogue, and advocating for the recognition of indigenous peoples as equal partners in governance. By continuing to push for policies that protect their rights and empower their communities, the IPMR will leave a lasting impact on the political landscape of the Philippines and contribute to the creation of a more just and equitable society for all its citizens. The Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, has become a key figure in national policy reform, especially in areas that directly affect the lives, lands, and cultures of indigenous peoples. The role of the IPMR is not just limited to local governance. It extends to the shaping of national policies that impact indigenous communities across the Philippines. As the Philippines continues to grapple with challenges related to land rights, cultural preservation, and sustainable development, the IPMR plays a crucial role in advocating for policy changes that prioritize the interests and rights of indigenous peoples. One of the most significant areas where the IPMR's influence is felt is in land rights and land use policies. In recent decades, indigenous peoples in the Philippines have faced increasing pressure from large-scale mining, logging, and agricultural projects that encroach upon their ancestral domains. The IPMR serves as a vital advocate for the protection of these lands, ensuring that any development projects respect the rights of indigenous peoples and are conducted in accordance with the principles of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. By lobbying for stronger land rights protections, the IPMR helps ensure that indigenous communities retain control over their ancestral lands and resources, preventing exploitation and environmental degradation. In addition to land rights, the IPMR is also instrumental in pushing for the inclusion of indigenous peoples' concerns in national development agendas. Indigenous communities are often excluded from the benefits of national development, and their concerns are overlooked in mainstream policy debates. The IPMR ensures that indigenous issues, such as poverty, lack of access to healthcare, and inadequate education, are addressed in national policies. By advocating for policies that are tailored to the needs of indigenous peoples, the IPMR helps to bridge the gap between indigenous communities and the broader national development framework. Furthermore, the IPMR plays a key role in fostering the recognition of indigenous knowledge and practices in national policy. Indigenous peoples possess valuable traditional knowledge about sustainable resource management, biodiversity conservation, and climate change adaptation. The IPMR ensures that this knowledge is integrated into national policies, particularly in areas related to environmental conservation and disaster risk reduction. By promoting the use of traditional ecological knowledge, the IPMR helps create more sustainable and resilient policies that benefit both indigenous communities and the broader population. The position of the IPMR in the Philippines is not only significant at the national level, but also at the global level, particularly in the context of international indigenous rights advocacy. Indigenous peoples worldwide have long been marginalized, and their rights often overlooked in international forums and discussions. However, in recent decades, there has been a growing recognition of the importance of indigenous peoples in global discussions on climate change, biodiversity, and human rights. The IPMR, as a recognized representative of indigenous peoples in the Philippines, plays a key role in ensuring that the concerns of indigenous communities are heard and addressed in international forums. The global movement for indigenous rights has gained momentum through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007. UNDRIP sets out a framework for the protection and promotion of the rights of indigenous peoples, emphasizing their right to self-determination, control over their lands and resources, and the preservation of their cultures. The IPMR is an important advocate for the implementation of these international standards in the Philippines, ensuring that national policies align with global commitments to indigenous rights. The IPMR also plays a critical role in advocating for the inclusion of indigenous perspectives in global discussions on sustainable development, climate change, and environmental protection. Indigenous peoples are often on the front lines of environmental degradation and climate change, with their lands and ways of life threatened by rising sea levels, deforestation, and resource extraction. The IPMR helps ensure that indigenous peoples are represented in international climate change negotiations, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and that their traditional knowledge is recognized as a valuable resource for addressing global environmental challenges. Moreover, the IPMR's participation in international human rights forums ensures that the concerns of indigenous peoples are included in broader human rights discussions. Indigenous peoples face unique challenges, including forced displacement, land grabbing, and the erosion of their cultural identity. By advocating for the protection of indigenous rights at the international level, the IPMR helps bring global attention to these issues and ensures that the rights of indigenous peoples are upheld in international law. The IPMR's involvement in global indigenous rights advocacy is particularly important as the world becomes more interconnected. Globalization has brought both opportunities and challenges for indigenous communities, and the IPMR helps navigate these complex dynamics by ensuring that indigenous peoples are not marginalized in the global discourse on development, sustainability, and human rights. The long-term vision for the role of the IPMR in the Philippines involves greater autonomy and self-determination for indigenous communities. While the IPMR has made significant strides in advocating for indigenous rights, the ultimate goal is to ensure that indigenous peoples can fully exercise their right to self-governance and make decisions about their own futures. This includes having greater control over their lands, resources, and cultural practices, as well as the ability to govern themselves according to their own customs and traditions. Greater autonomy for indigenous communities would allow them to have more control over their development and ensure that their rights are upheld without interference from external forces. The IPMR, as a representative of indigenous communities in local government, plays a central role in advocating for this increased autonomy. By pushing for the recognition of indigenous peoples as sovereign entities with the right to self-determination, the IPMR helps lay the groundwork for a more inclusive and equitable political system that respects indigenous peoples' cultural and political rights. Achieving greater autonomy would also involve strengthening indigenous governance structures. While the IPMR serves as a key figure in local government, indigenous peoples also rely on their traditional political systems, which have long been in place to guide decision-making and resource management. Strengthening these traditional governance systems and ensuring that they are recognized by the state would enable indigenous peoples to govern themselves in a way that aligns with their cultural values and practices. Furthermore, greater autonomy for indigenous peoples would allow them to take a more active role in decision-making processes at the local, national, and international levels. This includes having a stronger voice in policies related to land use, environmental protection, education, and healthcare. By ensuring that indigenous communities have the power to shape their own destinies, the IPMR plays a key role in advancing the goal of self-determination and autonomy. Ultimately, the path toward greater autonomy and self-determination for indigenous peoples is a long and challenging one, but the IPMR's role is central to achieving this vision. Through continued advocacy, legal reforms, and the strengthening of indigenous governance systems, the IPMR can help ensure that indigenous peoples are fully empowered to exercise their rights and shape their own futures. The Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, plays a crucial role in the protection and management of ancestral domains, which are the lands, waters, and natural resources traditionally owned and managed by indigenous peoples. Ancestral domains are the foundation of indigenous identity and culture, and they are integral to the economic, social, and spiritual well-being of these communities. However, these lands have long been subjected to encroachment and exploitation by external forces, including mining companies, logging firms, and large-scale agricultural operations. The IPMR's role in safeguarding ancestral domains is multifaceted and includes legal advocacy, community organizing, and environmental protection. One of the primary responsibilities of the IPMR is to ensure that indigenous communities retain control over their ancestral lands, and that these lands are not sold, leased, or otherwise exploited without their free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. FPIC is a cornerstone of Indigenous rights under the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, and the IPMR is responsible for ensuring that it is respected in all development activities that affect Indigenous territories. The IPMR works closely with government agencies, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and international bodies to advocate for stronger legal protections for ancestral domains. This includes pushing for the implementation of policies that prevent land grabbing and encroachment by outside entities. The IPMR also helps to document cases of land rights violations and advocates for legal action when ancestral domains are threatened or illegally taken. Additionally, the IPMR plays an important role in raising awareness about the importance of ancestral domains in the broader context of national development. Indigenous lands are often rich in biodiversity and natural resources, and they play a crucial role in environmental conservation. The IPMR ensures that policymakers and the public understand the environmental value of ancestral domains, which are often home to unique ecosystems and species. Through their advocacy, the IPMR helps to ensure that Indigenous territories are protected not just for the benefit of the communities that live there, but also for the broader environmental health of the nation. Finally, the IPMR is instrumental in ensuring that development projects in ancestral domains are sustainable and respectful of Indigenous cultures. This includes advocating for projects that are aligned with traditional ecological knowledge and that provide benefits to Indigenous communities without compromising their way of life. By ensuring that development projects respect the land, culture, and rights of Indigenous peoples, the IPMR helps to strike a balance between economic development and cultural preservation. Another important aspect of the IPMR's role is promoting the economic empowerment of Indigenous communities. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines have historically been excluded from mainstream economic opportunities, often facing systemic barriers to education, employment, and financial independence. As a result, many Indigenous communities live in poverty and lack access to the resources necessary for economic development. The IPMR serves as an advocate for policies and programs that promote the economic welfare of Indigenous peoples, ensuring that they have the tools and opportunities they need to thrive in the modern economy while preserving their cultural traditions. One of the primary ways the IPMR promotes economic empowerment is by advocating for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in national development plans. This includes pushing for the allocation of resources for education, healthcare, and infrastructure in Indigenous communities, as well as advocating for programs that support sustainable livelihoods. The IPMR ensures that Indigenous communities are not excluded from national economic policies and that they receive their fair share of resources and opportunities. In addition to advocating for national policies, the IPMR also works to promote community-based economic development projects. These projects are designed to empower Indigenous communities by providing them with the skills and resources they need to build sustainable livelihoods. For example, the IPMR may support programs that focus on sustainable agriculture, ecotourism, or the production of traditional handicrafts, all of which provide Indigenous communities with income-generating opportunities that align with their cultural values and environmental stewardship. The IPMR also advocates for the protection of Indigenous intellectual property and traditional knowledge. Indigenous peoples possess valuable knowledge about agriculture, medicine, and natural resource management that has been passed down through generations. However, this knowledge is often at risk of exploitation by outside entities. The IPMR works to ensure that Indigenous communities have control over their traditional knowledge and that they are able to benefit from it economically. This includes advocating for the recognition of Indigenous knowledge in intellectual property laws and ensuring that Indigenous communities are able to negotiate fair agreements with companies that wish to use their traditional knowledge for commercial purposes. Furthermore, the IPMR promotes the creation of economic partnerships between Indigenous communities and other stakeholders, including government agencies, businesses, and NGOs. These partnerships can provide Indigenous communities with access to resources, markets, and technical expertise, helping them to develop their economic potential. The IPMR ensures that these partnerships are built on principles of respect, fairness, and mutual benefit, and that they prioritize the needs and aspirations of Indigenous peoples. Ultimately, the IPMR's role in promoting economic empowerment is about ensuring that Indigenous peoples are able to participate fully in the modern economy without sacrificing their cultural identity or environmental values. By advocating for policies and programs that support Indigenous economic development, the IPMR helps to create a more equitable society where Indigenous communities have the opportunities they need to thrive. As the IPMR position continues to evolve, one of the most important aspects of its future will be the development of Indigenous leadership. The IPMR is not just a representative figure, but also a leader within the Indigenous community. The success of the IPMR's work depends on the ability of Indigenous peoples to actively participate in governance and to build strong, self-sustaining leadership structures within their communities. The IPMR plays a crucial role in nurturing and mentoring the next generation of Indigenous leaders, ensuring that there is a continuous cycle of leadership within Indigenous communities. One of the key components of building Indigenous leadership is providing opportunities for young people, women, and other marginalized groups within Indigenous communities to take on leadership roles. The IPMR works to empower these individuals by providing mentorship, education, and training in governance, advocacy, and community organizing. This ensures that Indigenous communities have a strong pipeline of future leaders who are well-equipped to continue the work of the IPMR and advance the rights and welfare of their people. The IPMR also plays a critical role in promoting the participation of women and youth in governance and decision-making processes. In many Indigenous communities, women and youth have traditionally been excluded from leadership roles, but the IPMR is working to change this. By advocating for gender equality and the inclusion of young people in decision-making, the IPMR helps to create more inclusive and dynamic leadership structures that reflect the diversity and strengths of Indigenous communities. Furthermore, the IPMR encourages the development of Indigenous-led organizations that can work in collaboration with government agencies, NGOs, and other stakeholders to address the needs of Indigenous peoples. These organizations serve as important vehicles for community empowerment, providing platforms for Indigenous peoples to advocate for their rights, access resources, and engage with external partners. By fostering the growth of Indigenous-led organizations, the IPMR helps ensure that Indigenous peoples have the capacity to advocate for themselves and shape their own future. The legacy of the IPMR will ultimately be defined by the strength and resilience of Indigenous leadership. By nurturing future generations of leaders, the IPMR ensures that Indigenous communities will continue to have a voice in governance and that their rights, cultures, and lands will be protected for future generations. The Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, has become an integral part of the political landscape in the Philippines, particularly in local governance. As an ex officio member of the local legislative council, the IPMR plays a critical role in ensuring that Indigenous voices are heard and considered in the policy-making process. This role is crucial in a country where Indigenous peoples have historically been excluded from political participation and their rights overlooked in national and local development plans. The political influence of the IPMR extends beyond mere representation. The IPMR serves as a direct link between Indigenous communities and local government units, LGUs, ensuring that the concerns, needs, and aspirations of Indigenous peoples are integrated into the political process. By participating in legislative sessions, the IPMR can sponsor or co-sponsor ordinances, resolutions, and laws that directly impact Indigenous communities. This includes laws related to land rights, the protection of ancestral domains, cultural preservation, and social services tailored to the specific needs of indigenous peoples. Moreover, the IPMR's position allows them to influence the allocation of resources within the LGU. Indigenous communities often face systemic neglect, with their needs being sidelined in favor of more populous or politically influential groups. Through the IPMR's advocacy, resources can be directed toward addressing critical issues in indigenous communities, such as access to healthcare, education, infrastructure, and economic development. This ensures that the political and economic needs of indigenous peoples are prioritized and that they are not excluded from the benefits of governance. The IPMR's role also has implications for national governance. While the IPMR's formal duties are focused on local governance, their influence extends to national policymaking, particularly in areas related to indigenous rights and development. As the representative of indigenous peoples, the IPMR can serve as a voice for indigenous communities in national discussions on land reform, environmental policies, and development priorities. By participating in national forums and consultations, the IPMR can help shape policies that are more inclusive of indigenous peoples, ensuring that their needs and rights are fully considered in national governance. In addition to its political role, the IPMR is also a key player in the social integration of indigenous peoples into broader society. Indigenous communities in the Philippines have long been marginalized, with their cultures and rights often overlooked by mainstream society. The IPMR helps bridge the gap between indigenous peoples and the larger population, fostering social cohesion and mutual respect. One of the primary functions of the IPMR is to advocate for the recognition and respect of indigenous cultures and traditions. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines have unique languages, customs, and practices that are integral to their identity. However, these cultures have often been devalued or dismissed in the context of a rapidly modernizing society. The IPMR works to ensure that indigenous cultures are celebrated and preserved, advocating for their inclusion in educational curricula, media, and public policy. Through their work, the IPMR also promotes the protection of indigenous languages, which are vital to the cultural identity and heritage of indigenous communities. Many indigenous languages in the Philippines are endangered, and the IPMR has been instrumental in ensuring that efforts are made to revitalize and preserve these languages. This includes advocating for language education programs in schools, supporting indigenous language media outlets, and organizing cultural events that highlight the richness and diversity of indigenous languages. Furthermore, the IPMR helps to ensure that indigenous peoples are not socially excluded or discriminated against. Discrimination against indigenous peoples remains a significant issue in many parts of the country, with many communities facing prejudice and stereotyping. The IPMR works to combat this by promoting awareness of indigenous peoples' rights, educating the public about their cultures, and advocating for the inclusion of indigenous perspectives in national discussions on social justice. The IPMR also plays an important role in promoting gender equality and the inclusion of marginalized groups within indigenous communities. Indigenous women, in particular, often face multiple layers of discrimination, including gender-based violence, limited access to education, and economic marginalization. The IPMR advocates for the empowerment of indigenous women, ensuring that they have equal opportunities for education, employment, and leadership roles within their communities. By promoting gender equality, the IPMR helps to create more inclusive and equitable indigenous communities. The IPMR's role extends beyond social and political advocacy into the realm of environmental stewardship and sustainability. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines are often the custodians of some of the most ecologically important and biodiverse regions in the country. These communities have a deep understanding of environmental conservation, having lived in harmony with nature for centuries. However, their lands and resources are increasingly under threat from industrialization, deforestation, mining, and climate change. The IPMR plays a key role in ensuring that Indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge and practices are integrated into environmental policies at the local and national levels. This includes advocating for the inclusion of traditional ecological knowledge, TK, in resource management, land use planning, and conservation efforts. Indigenous peoples have developed sophisticated methods for sustainable agriculture, water management, and forest preservation, and the IPMR works to ensure that these practices are recognized and incorporated into modern environmental policies. In addition to promoting the use of TK, the IPMR is also responsible for advocating for the protection of indigenous ancestral domains from exploitation by external entities. Mining, logging, and large-scale agricultural projects often threaten the environmental integrity of indigenous lands, leading to deforestation, soil erosion, and the loss of biodiversity. The IPMR ensures that indigenous communities are informed about these threats and that they have a voice in decisions related to the use of their lands and resources. Through their advocacy, the IPMR helps to protect the environment not just for indigenous peoples, but for the broader public as well. The IPMR also works to address the impacts of climate change, which disproportionately affect indigenous communities. Many indigenous peoples live in ecologically sensitive areas that are highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, such as rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and shifts in agricultural patterns. The IPMR helps to ensure that indigenous communities are included in climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts, advocating for policies that provide support for indigenous peoples in the face of climate-related challenges. This includes pushing for the recognition of indigenous knowledge as a critical component of national and international climate change strategies. Ultimately, the IPMR's role in environmental stewardship is about ensuring that indigenous peoples continue to play an active role in the protection and preservation of the Philippines' natural resources. By advocating for sustainable development, environmental protection, and the recognition of indigenous knowledge, the IPMR helps to create a more sustainable future for all Filipinos, while ensuring that indigenous communities remain the stewards of their ancestral lands. As the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, position continues to evolve, its role in shaping national policy is becoming increasingly important. The IPMR's integration into local governance has allowed indigenous communities to have a more direct impact on policy decisions that affect their lives, but the future of the IPMR holds even greater potential for broader national influence. The continued inclusion of indigenous voices in national policymaking will be crucial for ensuring that indigenous peoples' rights are fully recognized and respected across the Philippines. Historically, indigenous communities have been sidelined in national development plans, with their rights and needs overlooked by policymakers. However, the establishment of the IPMR role has created a direct channel for indigenous peoples to engage with the formal political system. This has allowed for the advocacy of policies that protect indigenous lands, promote cultural preservation, and ensure the social well-being of indigenous communities. As the position of the IPMR becomes more established, it is expected that its influence will continue to grow, enabling indigenous representatives to shape national policies related to land use, resource management, education, health, and economic development. The growing influence of the IPMR is not just limited to local governance, but extends to the national level, where indigenous peoples' rights must be addressed within the context of broader national policies. The IPMR has the potential to advocate for indigenous peoples in key areas such as climate change adaptation, resource management, and environmental protection. As the Philippines faces urgent environmental challenges, the IPMR's role as a representative of indigenous peoples is vital in ensuring that traditional ecological knowledge and sustainable practices are integrated into national policy frameworks. Moreover, The role of the IPMR can contribute to a more inclusive and democratic society by ensuring that Indigenous peoples have a seat at the table in decision-making processes. By advocating for Indigenous perspectives in national policy discussions, the IPMR can help shape a future where Indigenous communities are recognized as equal partners in governance, with their rights and cultures fully integrated into the national framework. The scope of the IPMR's responsibilities has already expanded significantly since the position's inception, and it is likely to continue evolving to meet the growing needs of Indigenous communities. While the IPMR was initially tasked with representing Indigenous peoples in local legislative councils, the future of the role could include a wider range of responsibilities that address the broader needs of Indigenous communities, particularly in relation to national governance and development. One potential area for expansion is the IPMR's involvement in national policy advocacy. As the IPMR becomes more established in local governance, there is a growing recognition of the need for Indigenous representation at the national level. This could include the creation of additional positions for Indigenous representatives in the national legislature, enabling Indigenous peoples to have a more direct influence on national policies that affect them. By advocating for Indigenous representation at the national level, the IPMR can help ensure that Indigenous peoples have a voice in the legislative process and that their rights are fully recognized in national laws. In addition to policy advocacy, the IPMR's responsibilities could also expand to include a greater role in managing and overseeing Indigenous development programs. As the IPMR continues to serve as a bridge between Indigenous communities and local government, there is potential for the role to take on a leadership position in coordinating development initiatives that are specifically tailored to the needs of Indigenous peoples. This could include overseeing projects related to education, healthcare, infrastructure, and economic development, ensuring that these programs are culturally appropriate and designed to improve the long-term well-being of Indigenous communities. Another area where the IPMR's role could expand is in the realm of environmental stewardship and natural resource management. Indigenous peoples have long been stewards of the land, and their traditional ecological knowledge is invaluable in addressing the environmental challenges facing the Philippines. The IPMR could play a larger role in advocating for the integration of traditional knowledge into national environmental policies, particularly in areas related to climate change mitigation and adaptation. By expanding the IPMR's responsibilities in environmental governance, the Philippines can ensure that Indigenous communities remain central to efforts to protect the environment and promote sustainable development. As the role of the IPMR continues to evolve, it will also contribute to strengthening Indigenous political participation across the country. One of the primary functions of the IPMR is to ensure that Indigenous communities have a voice in local and national governance. However, the long-term impact of the IPMR will be realized when Indigenous peoples themselves are fully empowered to participate in the political process and to lead their own development. The future of the IPMR lies in the continued strengthening of Indigenous political systems and the capacity of Indigenous peoples to self-govern. Indigenous communities in the Philippines have their own systems of governance, based on customary laws and traditional decision-making processes. These systems are deeply rooted in the cultures and values of Indigenous peoples and have long served as the foundation for community life. The IPMR plays a vital role in ensuring that these traditional governance systems are respected and integrated into the formal political system. In the future, it is crucial that the IPMR works to strengthen the Indigenous political structures, IPS, within communities, ensuring that these structures are capable of managing the complex challenges that Indigenous peoples face. This includes providing training and capacity-building programs for Indigenous leaders, ensuring that they have the skills and knowledge needed to navigate the formal political system and to advocate for the rights of their communities effectively. By strengthening the leadership capacity within indigenous communities, the IPMR can help to create a more robust and self-sustaining political system that empowers indigenous peoples to lead their own development. The continued development of indigenous leadership will also help ensure that indigenous peoples have a stronger voice in national governance. In the long term, the IPMR's role can serve as a stepping stone toward greater political representation for indigenous peoples in all levels of government. As indigenous communities continue to assert their rights and strengthen their political participation, the IPMR can help ensure that their voices are not just heard but respected in the political process. Ultimately, the future of the IPMR lies in the continued empowerment of indigenous peoples, ensuring that they are not only represented in governance, but also actively shaping the future of the country. By fostering political participation, strengthening leadership, and advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples, the IPMR can contribute to a more inclusive and just society for all Filipinos. The future trajectory of the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, role is intrinsically linked to the broader goal of advancing indigenous self-determination. While the IPMR has made significant strides in representing indigenous communities within local governance structures, the ultimate aim is to create a political environment in which indigenous peoples are able to fully exercise their right to self-governance. Self-determination is the cornerstone of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, and the basis for the IPMR's advocacy. As the Philippines continues to evolve politically, the role of the IPMR will be crucial in ensuring that indigenous peoples are not merely participants in governance, but have the autonomy to make decisions that affect their communities, lands, and cultures. A central aspect of this self-determination involves the recognition of indigenous governance systems. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines have historically governed themselves through systems that are rooted in their cultural traditions and customary laws. The role of the IPMR can significantly contribute to the recognition and strengthening of these governance systems. As an official representative in local legislative bodies, the IPMR can advocate for the integration of indigenous governance practices into the formal political structure, ensuring that these systems are respected and protected under national law. This would allow indigenous communities to govern themselves in a manner that aligns with their cultural values while still participating in the broader national framework. Moreover, advancing self-determination for indigenous peoples involves the ability to control their own economic, social, and cultural development. The IPMR's advocacy for sustainable development models, grounded in traditional ecological knowledge and practices, will be vital in promoting an approach that allows indigenous communities to flourish without compromising their cultural identity or environmental sustainability. In the future, the IPMR's role could expand to oversee indigenous-led development initiatives that empower communities to manage their own resources, create sustainable livelihoods, and promote educational opportunities that align with their cultural heritage. The broader vision for self-determination goes beyond political representation. It entails a shift in how indigenous peoples are perceived by the state and society at large. The IPMR's future role will be pivotal in this transformation, advocating for policies that not only respect but actively promote indigenous peoples' rights to self-governance, self-determination, and cultural preservation. By continuing to empower indigenous communities through political representation, capacity building, and advocacy, the IPMR can help bring about a more equitable and inclusive future for all Filipinos. As the IPMR role continues to gain influence, there is significant potential for its expansion into both national and international arenas. Currently, the IPMR's primary focus is on local governance, but the future could see the role evolve into a more prominent position at the national level, representing indigenous peoples in national policymaking and international forums. This expanded influence could help address the persistent challenges faced by indigenous communities, such as land dispossession, social exclusion, and environmental degradation, while ensuring that their unique perspectives are incorporated into national development strategies. One of the ways the IPMR's influence could grow is through stronger representation in the national legislature. While the IPMR's position currently exists at the local government level, there is increasing recognition of the need for indigenous representation at the national level. The creation of a dedicated indigenous seat in the national legislature could provide a stronger voice for indigenous peoples in national governance. The IPMR's experience in local legislative councils positions them well to advocate for such a development. By establishing a formal role for indigenous peoples in the national legislative process, the government can ensure that indigenous concerns are directly addressed in national policy and lawmaking. Moreover, the IPMR's work could extend beyond the national political landscape and into international forums, where indigenous rights and environmental issues are gaining increasing attention. Indigenous communities around the world face shared challenges, such as the loss of land and resources, cultural assimilation, and climate change impacts. The IPMR's role as a representative of indigenous peoples can be leveraged to build alliances with other indigenous leaders globally, strengthening advocacy for indigenous rights at the international level. By participating in international forums such as the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, UNPFII, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, the IPMR can help ensure that indigenous peoples' concerns are addressed in global discussions on human rights, environmental protection, and sustainable development. The growing international recognition of indigenous peoples' rights has opened up new avenues for advocacy, and the IPMR can play a key role in this. In the future, the IPMR could be instrumental in advocating for the implementation of international agreements, such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, in the Philippines. By strengthening ties with international organizations, the IPMR can ensure that indigenous peoples' rights are upheld not only within the national context, but also on the global stage. While the role of the IPMR holds great potential for advancing indigenous peoples' rights and promoting self-determination, it also faces a number of emerging challenges. As the political landscape continues to shift, the IPMR will need to adapt to new circumstances and address the evolving needs of indigenous communities. One of the key challenges the IPMR will face in the future is ensuring the sustainability and continuity of the position itself. As indigenous communities gain greater recognition and political influence, the IPMR must evolve to address new issues that arise, including technological advancements, environmental challenges, and the impacts of globalization. One of the emerging challenges is the increasing threat of land grabbing and the encroachment of development projects on indigenous territories. Mining, logging, and large-scale agriculture projects continue to pose significant risks to indigenous lands, and the IPMR will need to strengthen its advocacy to protect ancestral domains from exploitation. This includes pushing for stronger legal protections for indigenous lands, ensuring that policies requiring free, prior, and informed consent (FPC) are strictly enforced, and advocating for the sustainable management of natural resources within indigenous territories. Another challenge that the IPMR will face is the growing influence of external actors in indigenous communities. As globalization continues to reshape the world, indigenous communities are increasingly exposed to pressures from multinational corporations, foreign governments, and international markets. These external actors may seek to exploit indigenous lands, resources, and labor for profit, often at the expense of indigenous cultures and rights. The IPMR will need to build stronger partnerships with local, national, and international organizations to counter these pressures and ensure that indigenous peoples' interests are protected. Additionally, the IPMR must continue to address internal challenges within Indigenous communities, such as gender inequality, poverty, and limited access to education and healthcare. Empowering Indigenous women and youth, in particular, will be critical to the long-term success of the IPMR's work. The role of the IPMR can also be expanded to include the promotion of Indigenous-led development initiatives, such as community-run businesses, education programs, and healthcare services, which will help ensure that Indigenous communities are self-sufficient and resilient in the face of external pressures. In conclusion, while there are significant challenges ahead, the future of the IPMR holds great promise for advancing the rights, welfare, and self-determination of Indigenous peoples in the Philippines. By continuing to adapt to new challenges, expanding its influence, and ensuring the sustainability of the position, the IPMR will play a pivotal role in shaping a more inclusive, equitable, and culturally diverse future for all Filipinos. The IPMR's role in advocating for Indigenous education and knowledge. One of the most important areas where the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, can have a lasting impact is in the development and advocacy for Indigenous education. Education is a powerful tool for empowerment and can help bridge the gap between Indigenous communities and the broader national society. However, traditional education systems often fail to meet the unique needs of Indigenous peoples, particularly in terms of preserving their cultural heritage and incorporating their traditional knowledge systems. The IPMR's role in advocating for Indigenous education is crucial in ensuring that these communities have access to education that is both culturally relevant and effective in preparing them for the modern world. Indigenous peoples possess a wealth of traditional knowledge related to agriculture, medicine, spirituality, and environmental management. This knowledge is passed down through generations, often through oral traditions and community practices. However, this knowledge is at risk of being lost as younger generations become increasingly disconnected from their cultural roots due to the pressures of modernization and globalization. The IPMR can help ensure that Indigenous knowledge is preserved and integrated into educational curricula, both within Indigenous communities and in broader educational systems. The IPMR can advocate for the inclusion of Indigenous languages in the school curriculum, ensuring that younger generations are fluent in their ancestral tongues. Language is central to cultural identity, and preserving Indigenous languages is crucial for maintaining cultural heritage. By incorporating Indigenous languages and traditional knowledge into formal education, the IPMR helps ensure that Indigenous youth grow up with a strong sense of identity and pride in their heritage. Furthermore, the IPMR can promote the establishment of community-based schools that reflect the values and needs of Indigenous peoples. These schools would be designed with input from local Indigenous leaders, educators, and parents to ensure that the curriculum aligns with community values and priorities. The IPMR can also advocate for the professional development of Indigenous teachers who understand both the formal education system and the unique needs of Indigenous students. By empowering Indigenous educators, the IPMR helps to create a sustainable and culturally appropriate educational system that can continue to serve Indigenous communities for generations to come. The role of the IPMR is also crucial in strengthening the economic development of Indigenous communities in the Philippines. Historically, Indigenous peoples have been marginalized in the national economy, with limited access to economic opportunities and resources. As a result, many Indigenous communities face high levels of poverty, unemployment, and economic exclusion. The IPMR can play a key role in addressing these disparities by advocating for economic policies that support the self-sufficiency and empowerment of Indigenous communities. One area where the IPMR can make a significant impact is in promoting sustainable economic development that aligns with Indigenous values and traditions. Indigenous communities have a deep connection to the land, and their traditional livelihoods, such as agriculture, fishing, and handicrafts, are an integral part of their cultural identity. The IPMR can advocate for the protection of these traditional livelihoods, ensuring that indigenous peoples can continue to rely on their natural resources while promoting sustainable practices. In addition to preserving traditional livelihoods, the IPMR can advocate for the development of new economic opportunities that are culturally appropriate and sustainable. For example, the IPMR can help promote ecotourism, which allows indigenous communities to share their cultural heritage with visitors while generating income and preserving the environment. Ecotourism can provide a platform for indigenous peoples to showcase their traditions, arts, and crafts, while also creating jobs and supporting local businesses. The IPMR can also advocate for the establishment of microfinance programs that provide indigenous entrepreneurs with the capital and resources needed to start and grow small businesses. These programs can help indigenous communities build economic independence and reduce reliance on external aid or government assistance. The IPMR's advocacy for microfinance and small business development can empower indigenous peoples to take control of their economic futures, ensuring that they are not left behind in the country's economic growth. Furthermore, the IPMR can work to ensure that indigenous peoples have access to markets where they can sell their goods and services. This could involve advocating for fair trade initiatives that provide indigenous artisans and farmers with access to global markets while ensuring that they are paid fair wages for their work. The IPMR can also push for the development of infrastructure, such as roads and transportation networks, that makes it easier for indigenous communities to access markets and other economic opportunities. Ultimately, the IPMR's role in economic development is about creating sustainable, culturally appropriate opportunities that allow indigenous communities to thrive. By advocating for policies and programs that support indigenous entrepreneurship, traditional livelihoods, and sustainable development, the IPMR helps ensure that indigenous peoples can maintain their cultural integrity while improving their economic well-being. The empowerment of indigenous women and youth is a central focus of the IPMR's work. Indigenous women, in particular, have historically faced marginalization both within their communities and in broader society. They often have limited access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities, and their voices are frequently excluded from decision-making processes. Similarly, indigenous youth face significant challenges, including a lack of access to quality education, unemployment, and a disconnect from their cultural heritage. The IPMR can play a pivotal role in empowering indigenous women and youth by advocating for policies and programs that address their specific needs and concerns. This includes promoting gender equality and ensuring that indigenous women have equal access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. The IPMR can work to ensure that women are represented in leadership positions within their communities and that their voices are heard in decision-making processes. In addition to gender equality, the IPMR can advocate for the inclusion of indigenous youth in leadership and governance. Many indigenous communities face the challenge of intergenerational transmission of knowledge, with younger generations becoming increasingly disconnected from traditional practices and values. The IPMR can encourage the participation of youth in community leadership roles and decision-making, ensuring that they have a stake in the future of their communities. By fostering youth leadership, the IPMR helps to create a sustainable and resilient indigenous community that can continue to thrive for generations to come. The IPMR can also advocate for the development of programs that provide indigenous youth with the skills and opportunities they need to succeed in the modern world while remaining connected to their cultural roots. This could include vocational training programs, mentorship opportunities, and leadership development initiatives that help youth build the confidence and skills necessary to take on leadership roles in their communities. Empowering indigenous women and youth is not only important for the well-being of these individuals, but is also essential for the broader community's development. By supporting women and youth, The IPMR helps ensure that indigenous communities are strong, resilient, and capable of facing the challenges of the future while preserving their cultural heritage. One of the most significant impacts the Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, can have on the broader national governance framework is through strengthening the human rights protections for Indigenous peoples. The position of the IPMR is intrinsically tied to the recognition and implementation of Indigenous peoples' human rights, both at the local and national levels. In the context of the Philippines, the IPMR is positioned to ensure that the rights of Indigenous communities are not only acknowledged in policy, but are actively defended in practice. The role serves as an essential advocate for addressing the long-standing systemic human rights violations faced by Indigenous peoples, including land dispossession, forced displacement, and cultural assimilation. The establishment of the IPMR was a direct response to the historical exclusion of Indigenous peoples from formal political processes. Indigenous peoples have long faced marginalization, their rights often overlooked or intentionally ignored. The IPMR role was created to address these injustices, giving Indigenous peoples a voice in governance that can influence national laws and regulations. As an ex officio member of the local legislative councils, the IPMR is tasked with advocating for the rights and needs of Indigenous communities, ensuring that laws and policies reflect the unique needs of these communities. Another major area where the IPMR can significantly impact national governance is in the promotion of inclusive economic policies. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines, like many indigenous communities around the world, have been historically excluded from mainstream economic systems. The IPMR, as a representative of indigenous peoples in local and national governance, is well placed to advocate for policies that foster economic inclusion, empowerment, and sustainability for indigenous communities. Economic marginalization is one of the most pressing issues faced by indigenous peoples, with many living in poverty and having limited access to formal employment, capital, and resources. The IPMR plays a crucial role in addressing this inequality by advocating for policies that support the economic empowerment of indigenous communities. This includes advocating for land reform programs that provide secure land tenure for indigenous peoples, allowing them to cultivate and manage their lands for sustainable economic development. The IPMR also helps to promote the development of alternative livelihood programs that are culturally appropriate and environmentally sustainable. For example, indigenous communities often rely on agriculture, ecotourism, and traditional crafts as their primary sources of income. The IPMR can advocate for government support to ensure that these livelihood opportunities are supported through training, infrastructure, and access to markets. This could include developing sustainable agricultural techniques that improve food security, promoting the sale of indigenous crafts, and encouraging ecotourism ventures that highlight indigenous cultures and traditional knowledge. Moreover, the IPMR can push for the integration of indigenous communities into broader national economic policies, ensuring that they are not excluded from key sectors such as agriculture, healthcare, education, and tourism. Through their role, the IPMR advocates for economic policies that are inclusive, ensuring that indigenous peoples have the tools and resources they need to succeed in the modern economy while maintaining their cultural integrity. Additionally, as the IPMR grows in influence, there is a significant opportunity for the position to advocate for economic policies at the national level that address issues such as access to finance, job creation, and community development specifically designed for indigenous peoples. By ensuring that these policies align with the cultural values and sustainable practices of indigenous communities, the IPMR can help ensure that economic development benefits all Filipinos, without excluding or exploiting the country's indigenous population. Environmental sustainability is another area where the IPMR can have a profound impact on national policy and governance. Indigenous peoples in the Philippines have long been stewards of the land, relying on natural resources for their livelihoods, while practicing sustainable methods of resource management. This deep connection to the land gives indigenous communities unique insights into environmental conservation and climate change adaptation. The IPMR's role in advocating for policies that promote environmental stewardship is essential for integrating indigenous knowledge into national environmental governance strategies. The Philippines is highly vulnerable to environmental degradation, deforestation, and the impacts of climate change, all of which disproportionately affect indigenous communities. The IPMR plays an essential role in ensuring that the traditional knowledge and practices of indigenous peoples are incorporated into national environmental policies, such as those related to biodiversity conservation, forest management, and natural resource protection. Indigenous peoples have developed sustainable practices that have helped maintain the ecological balance of their ancestral domains for generations, and the IPMR advocates for the recognition and integration of these practices in broader environmental strategies. For instance, sustainable farming practices that are practiced by many indigenous communities can offer important lessons in soil conservation and water management. The IPMR can push for these traditional agricultural techniques to be incorporated into national agricultural policies, encouraging sustainable land use across the country. Similarly, the IPMR can advocate for the protection of sacred sites and biodiversity hotspots within indigenous territories, ensuring that these areas are preserved for future generations. Furthermore, the IPMR can help ensure that indigenous communities are included in national and international climate change discussions. Indigenous peoples often live in ecologically sensitive areas, and they are among the first to experience the negative impacts of climate change, such as rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and disruptions to traditional livelihoods. The IPMR's role in advocating for indigenous peoples' participation in climate change policymaking ensures that their voices are heard in global discussions on climate change mitigation and adaptation. By advocating for indigenous knowledge in environmental governance, the IPMR not only contributes to the preservation of the country's rich biodiversity, but also supports global efforts to combat climate change. The future of environmental governance in the Philippines can be greatly enriched by the integration of indigenous practices and the active participation of indigenous peoples in national and international climate policy frameworks. The Indigenous Peoples Mandatory Representative, IPMR, plays a pivotal role in advocating for the protection of ancestral land rights, a core issue for many indigenous communities in the Philippines. Ancestral land is not merely a physical space, but a deeply ingrained part of indigenous identity, culture, and heritage. For indigenous peoples, their land is sacred. It is integral to their spirituality, traditional governance, and overall sense of belonging. As such, the IPMR's role in defending ancestral land rights is critical to preserving the very fabric of indigenous life. Over the years, indigenous communities have faced persistent challenges in securing legal recognition of their land rights. Despite the enactment of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, IPRA, in 1997, which was designed to protect the rights of indigenous peoples over their ancestral domains, many of these communities continue to face land dispossession, encroachment by mining corporations, and illegal land grabs. The IPMR, through its position in the local legislative council, serves as a strong advocate for the enforcement of land rights protections under IPRA and other relevant laws. A key part of the IPMR's work is ensuring that free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, is respected when any development or resource extraction projects are proposed in indigenous territories. FPIC is a fundamental principle under the IPRA that ensures that indigenous peoples have the right to make decisions about what happens on their ancestral land. The IPMR is tasked with safeguarding this process, ensuring that communities are not coerced into agreeing to projects that threaten their livelihoods or cultural practices. Whether it involves large-scale mining operations, logging, or other extractive industries, the IPMR must ensure that the voices of indigenous peoples are heard, their consent obtained, and their rights upheld in the face of external pressures. Moreover, environmental justice is an integral aspect of the IPMR's advocacy. Indigenous peoples have long been the stewards of some of the Philippines' most biodiverse ecosystems, and their land management practices have contributed to the preservation of these areas for generations. The IPMR's role includes promoting environmental policies that align with the traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous peoples, advocating for sustainable resource management practices that respect both cultural and environmental integrity. As the country faces growing environmental challenges, such as deforestation, pollution, and climate change, the IPMR's focus on integrating indigenous knowledge into environmental policy is vital to promoting long-term sustainability and ecological justice. One of the key areas where the IPMR contributes to modern governance is in the promotion and preservation of indigenous cultural rights. Indigenous cultures in the Philippines are rich in traditions, languages, customs, and practices, many of which are at risk of being lost due to globalization, modernization, and cultural assimilation. The IPMR's advocacy for cultural preservation ensures that indigenous peoples' unique cultural identities are recognized and celebrated within the national framework. The IPMR's role in protecting indigenous cultural rights is multifaceted. First and foremost, the IPMR advocates for the recognition and respect of indigenous languages. Many indigenous languages in the Philippines are endangered, with younger generations increasingly speaking only mainstream languages like Filipino or English. The IPMR can push for the inclusion of indigenous languages in education, media, and cultural programming, ensuring that these languages are preserved for future generations. By advocating for policies that encourage the use of indigenous languages in schools, local governance, and media, the IPMR helps to protect this critical aspect of indigenous heritage. In addition to language preservation, the IPMR also plays an essential role in advocating for the protection of sacred sites and cultural landmarks. Indigenous communities often consider certain sites sacred, either for spiritual, historical, or cultural reasons. These sacred sites are under threat from urban development, tourism, and resource extraction. The IPMR serves as a critical advocate for the legal recognition and protection of these sacred spaces, ensuring that they are preserved for future generations. This advocacy is not just about preserving the physical space, but also about protecting the cultural practices, stories, and ceremonies that are associated with these locations. Another significant area of cultural preservation is the safeguarding of traditional knowledge and practices. Indigenous peoples have developed unique systems of knowledge related to agriculture, medicine, spirituality, and governance, all of which are passed down through generations. The IPMR ensures that these knowledge systems are recognized and integrated into national policies, including in education, health, and environmental management. By advocating for the inclusion of indigenous knowledge in modern governance, the IPMR helps to ensure that these cultures are not relegated to the past, but are actively engaged in shaping the future. The IPMR's role in promoting cultural rights is essential in ensuring that indigenous peoples are not just seen as relics of the past, but are recognized as dynamic communities with valuable contributions to make to the nation's future. By fostering greater awareness of indigenous cultures, advocating for legal protections for cultural heritage, and promoting the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, the IPMR helps preserve the cultural richness of indigenous peoples. The empowerment of indigenous communities in the Philippines is, in many ways, dependent on their ability to fully participate in the political process. The establishment of the IPMR has played a critical role in ensuring that indigenous peoples are not excluded from governance and decision-making at the local and national levels. However, as the role of the IPMR continues to evolve, there is a growing need to strengthen Indigenous political representation and increase the participation of Indigenous peoples in broader political discussions. One of the key aspects of the IPMR's work is advocating for the political representation of Indigenous peoples at all levels of government. While the IPMR serves as an ex officio member of the local legislative councils, it is important that Indigenous communities continue to push for greater political representation, including the creation of more seats for Indigenous peoples in national legislative bodies. The IPMR can advocate for policies that ensure that Indigenous peoples have a voice in national governance, whether through reserved seats in Congress or through the creation of a separate Indigenous advisory body that can advise the government on issues affecting Indigenous communities. Furthermore, the IPMR can play a role in building the political capacity of Indigenous leaders. Many Indigenous communities face challenges in navigating the formal political system, which often operates in ways that are unfamiliar or contrary to traditional governance structures. By supporting leadership training, political education, and the development of advocacy skills, the IPMR can help to build a new generation of Indigenous leaders who are equipped to participate in formal political processes. These leaders can then advocate for policies that reflect the priorities of Indigenous communities and work to ensure that Indigenous peoples are fully integrated into the national political landscape. As the political participation of Indigenous peoples continues to expand, the IPMR's role will be critical in ensuring that these communities are empowered to shape their own futures. Whether through advocating for greater representation in government, supporting political education, or strengthening traditional governance systems, the IPMR will continue to play a central role in ensuring that Indigenous peoples have a seat at the table in the decision-making processes that affect their lives, lands, and cultures.